Welcome to the I Saved You, Now Do the Dishes podcast. I'm author and speaker Carrie Severson. In each episode, I'll share stories and tips from my experience with caregiving and advocacy through my husband's cancer journey. Hi, welcome back to the I Saved You, Now Do the Dishes podcast. If you are watching on YouTube, you will notice that my background is different. And if you're not watching on YouTube, my background's different. It's really weird to create something like a podcast talking about the past while I'm currently living what I think is season 2 of this shenanigans. I'm on a solo retreat, giving myself space, fresh air, healing. Currently at a cabin 4 hours north of where my husband is by myself. It is kind of spooky at night, but don't tell my parents that. But I really needed it. And you'll find out more, I guess, in season 2. So from here on out of season 1 of I Saved You, Now Do the Dishes, I'm just going to do a blanket sort of trigger warning. It does get it gets hard. It gets gross from here on out. And I'm grateful that I'm actually on this retreat, because what I have to share next is the really hard parts of his cancer journey for me, of what I had to do, of how hard I had to fight. And I'm appreciative of this beautiful, clear space that doesn't have the energy or the memories of cleaning up pools of blood and telling my husband I didn't think he was going to make it. So here we go. At the end of week 4, a doctor increased my husband's oxy 10 milligrams from every 4 hours to every 2 hours. So he's essentially always high and still in pain, significant pain, because the sores inside his neck were now touching from one side to the other. And there was scabs and blood all the time, everywhere. He would constantly cough up ropes of mucus. And as they would come out of his mouth, he'd be pulling out chunks of his throat and globs of blood everywhere. On the walls, on the floors, in the sink. So we show up at the hospital for Monday, week 5. I want to say his appointment's at like 9 a.m. And when you're taking oxy every 2 hours, essentially nobody's sleeping. So we were actually early for that appointment. We were so early that we went for a really small walk. Like it was probably 10 minutes. And it took everything out of him. So for you caregivers who are working with people and going through radiation specifically, a couple of tips. Obviously really high sunscreen, but huge sun hats, gigantic umbrellas that come far down. We have one that he put, he would just like put it almost on his head, and it came down to probably his elbows. He was always wearing long sleeves. The chemo port shirts had a sunscreen in them. He had a neck wrap. He had a hat, actually, that had a neck wrap on the back. He was always wearing sunglasses. I mean, the sun exposure for radiation patients is painful. He couldn't be outside for long periods of time. Excuse me, even with all that stuff. He was like a gremlin, at this point. But it was a beautiful day. It was like February 19th. And he wanted to enjoy before he went into radiation, knowing that he was going to be knocked out probably the rest of the day. So the first meeting we had was with the PA, who we didn't like. She was not a nice person. She should not have been in a client-facing position. And she reprimanded Gavin for losing 9 pounds from Thursday to Monday. That's legitimate. You know, I didn't think she was mean because of that. Her demeanor was just not great. I should have asked for somebody else from the beginning, but we just figured everyone has this experience, right? We didn't know what we didn't know. But she's giving him a hard time because now there's 2 conversations that have to happen. One is if you lose even 1 more pound, you have to get refitted for a new helmet. And she's like, how many Ensures are you drinking? And he's like, I don't know, maybe 1. And she's like, you should be drinking 5 or 6 a day. You need to get your calories up. Why aren't you doing this? And he's getting frustrated, and I'm not appreciating her tone. So something else for caregivers, medical advocates. When you have somebody in radiation and you've got somebody in like a nutritional role and then somebody else in like a speech and swallow therapist, if they're not on the same page, if they're not aligned in their messaging, get new people. I didn't do that. His speech and swallow therapist and the nutritionist were telling him very different things than the radiation team. Radiation didn't care how he got calories in. Speech and swallow was saying if he wasn't going to use his jaw, he would lose his jaw function. Nutrition was saying if he wasn't eating high protein meals and meat salads, chicken salad, egg salad, tuna salad, he was going to get even worse because protein was supposed to help him beat cancer, fight cancer. Everyone was saying something different, and it was very frustrating and exhausting, to be honest. So Gavin was just like, fuck this. I'm just going to get down when I can get down. Sometimes I'll have a yogurt. If I can get a grilled cheese, then great. He would go through, roller coasters. He'd be like, oh, I got a vanilla pudding down. Great. He would say vanilla pudding, but what he meant was a bite of vanilla pudding. There were very little calories come week 5. So here we are in this PA meeting, and I'm like, all right, well, let's talk about calories because he can't do it. At this point, he wasn't able, to really talk. I should say that as well. He was down to like 1 words. A lot of charades. One of my girlfriends was like, you should get another whiteboard, give it to him for communication. Too many whiteboards. But so it would be like, he'd point to his eye, and then he'd point to his heart, and he'd point to you. He did that a lot. He'd point to his watch, and that was typically like how much longer until my next dose. He said thanks. He said sorry a lot. He was always apologizing. There was this one time he was so high that he would fall asleep standing up. And I was so torn because I was like, he's so scared to lay down because the ropes of mucus would block his airways, and he would choke, and he would get freaked out and panic attacks. But obviously he can't sleep on his feet. He's going to fall and crack his head, but he's got to sleep. And so I would stand near him whenever I would catch him falling asleep on his feet, and he would just start to sway, and I'd like push him up against something and like lean him. I've said that before. He fell asleep a lot in between the counter and the refrigerator. So this one time he started coughing really badly, ropes some mucus, and I jumped up and, I want to be supportive. I'm standing close to him, but don't really know what to do. So I'm like gripping onto my thighs and I'm pacing and I can tell I'm holding my breath. And he looks at me and he's trying to suppress it. And he's like, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. And I'm like, I don't care. Just get it out. And he was in so much pain. By week 5, the scabs in his neck were essentially touching each other from one side to the other. And when he would pull up ropes of mucus, he would pull up chunks of throat and lots of blood. So sitting there in that PA meeting, he can't get anything else down. So let's talk about a feeding tube. And when I said that, I said, I think we should have a consult with the GI department for a feeding tube. Gavin went nuts. He just went ballistic. And he was like, despite the fact that he could barely speak, he said a lot right then. I can't remember if it was really audible or if it was just me being able to understand him. But I remember hearing, you don't get a say in this. I remember hearing, you're giving up on me. I don't want a feeding tube. And he said something else. But I looked at I actually was pretty pissed. I was like, the fuck, I don't get a say in this. I yelled back. The PA didn't say anything. I'm sure if you're a medical professional, I'm sure you've seen patients in this really dramatic sort of space freaking out in front of them. But when I was done yelling, I do get a say in this. You're going to die without a feeding tube. You need food. He didn't say anything. And I looked over at the PA and she's like, well, you are in danger of becoming too thin for the helmet, the radiation helmet. I do think you should have a conversation. And he was like, fuck, no way. I looked at the PA and I nodded. I don't think he saw me nod, but I'm fairly certain he had already turned his back and was on his way out the door. So that was the end of the meeting. I followed him. We didn't, have anything left to discuss with her. Walked back out to the lobby. We didn't say anything to one another. I didn't even really sit by him. He checked in for radiation, went back to the patient lounge, and I went to where my spot was. I found a place that I really liked in the lobby. I typically sat down on the ground in between this plant and a chair. I turned on my yoga app and I started to sway. And that is me trying to help my body get out of fight or flight. I stayed there doing yoga on the ground until he was ready. Came out of radiation with his neck wrapped. We didn't say anything to one another. And drove home in silence. He fell asleep in the car. By the time we got home, I was ready for another oxy. And I crashed on the couch. He crashed in the bed. I don't remember hearing him wake up. And typically at that point, you're on high alert consistently. Your body is so fried. But everything was so heavy that I passed out and stayed asleep until the phone rang. And it was the GI department. Gavin didn't wake up. But so I'm having a conversation with the GI scheduling department. And she's like, I understand you need to schedule an appointment to discuss a feeding tube. And I'm like, well, my husband hasn't agreed to it. He doesn't want one. I want one for him. But he won't agree to it. And she's like, well, we wouldn't be able to see him for 2 months anyway. So why don't we just schedule it? And I'm like, 2 months from now, without a feeding tube, my husband's going to be dead next week. Fuck 2 months. No, that can't be possible. And she's like, well, we're really backed up. And she said it like, what else do you want me to do? And I'm like, there's no point in 2 months. In 2 months from now, he'll either cross the finish line and, won't need a feeding tube, or he'll be dead. So goodbye. And I hung up. Sat there on the couch, staring at the TV and like paralyzed, absolutely frozen, because I really thought he was going to die. The hospital network that we were working with wouldn't be able to see him to support him. And I found it really weird that like the PA, this is how discombobulated this whole system is. The PA put in that morning a request for a consult. They got it that day, called me several hours later, but then wouldn't be able to even support us for 60 days minimum. No. So my mind starts working and I start thinking, and I'm like, okay, well, I need to find an additional specialist. I need to go to a different hospital network. I need to find him somebody to stick a tube in his stomach. I felt like we were back at square one. Gavin comes out of the bedroom at this point, and he's like purple, like from radiation. It got so bad that his skin turned purple and it's bleeding, and his neck wrap had come off while he was sleeping. And he's like, how are you? Are you okay? What's going on? I must have looked different. And I'm like, the GI department called. And he turns and he looks at me and he goes, what did you say to him? I said, you didn't agree to a consult. And he's like, good, I don't want one. I think I can do this without it. And I stood up and I walked over to him. We were standing on opposite sides of the kitchen counter. And I'm like, you're going to die without a feeding tube. And I don't know if I can hang out and watch you slowly die. And he's like, it won't get that bad, honey. It's that bad now, Gavin. I walked into the bedroom. He went, sat on the couch. We didn't talk the rest of the night. He let me sleep. He actually fell asleep sitting up on the couch. I didn't wake up until like 4 a.m. the next day. He was a strong dude, before cancer. He was an athlete. Cancer stripped a lot away from him. But that ego was still there. The like, I can do this. He didn't want to look any weaker than he was. But I was so pissed. I was pissed for all kinds of reasons. Not being able to see him for 2 months, him not agreeing to it. It felt like no matter where I stepped, I was on fire. So when that happens to you, dear caregivers, medical advocates, know that you're not alone. It happens over and over and over again. And all we can do is find a quiet place to sit down, move your body a little bit, take deep breaths, jump into a ice cold shower, and take a nap. Pray it gets better tomorrow. I'm going to leave it there. Thank you so much for being with me. I really appreciate it. I hope this supported you somehow in your journey. If you are a caregiver, please remember it's okay to have someone else do the dishes. Until next time.